Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and it's time to talk about the big bad of the Witchwood herself, Hagatha the Witch. Now, if you don't know what Hagatha the Witch is, then you probably haven't seen this video.
Sure, yeah, no, just walk right up, guys.
They're probably going to go get firewood and they'll be right back.
Yeah, we should just hang tight. Everything's gonna be fine.
No. What is that?
Guys, what was that? No, we cannot make that card. What is it? We cannot make that card.
It's too OP! It's too
Guys,
OP!
guys,
Leave
what?
the camera!
Run!
Run!
Guys, nerf it!
But now you know. Hagatha the Witch is the teased card that showed up in the reveal video for the Witchwood. All we saw is that it's a shaman card, it's a hero card, and it costs 8 mana, and that its name is Hagatha. And it has been confirmed already by Blizzard that this is a shaman card. It is going to be sort of the main evil of the Witchwood storyline, if you will. She's the witch who, I guess, turned the Witchwood into a scary, spooky place. And apparently it's going to be a pretty OP card as well. Not to mention it's going to be the only new hero card in the Witchwood expansion. So all of that sounds incredible, and clearly Blizzard has invested a lot into the hype of this card. So, in this video, I want to propose 5 possible designs for Hagatha the Witch. Now, some people will probably say, who cares about that? We're going to find out about the card in 2 weeks anyway. Why waste your time? Well, first off, because it's fun. And if you don't want to have fun talking about cards and theory crafting and speculating, then this video is probably not for you. And that's okay. But on top of that, I think exploring some of the possible designs for Hagatha, in particular in the context of Shaman, will help us explore exactly where Shaman's at right now, some of the failings of past mechanics that Blizzard has attempted over the last few expansions, and a way that a single card might perhaps bring those back to life, or might thematically connect into the Witchwood. So essentially, this just gives us a really nice way to talk about Shaman in a greater context. Also, of course, have some fun speculating about the new expansion. So all of that said, let's go ahead and jump into this. I've made 5 custom cards here, essentially, all Hagatha the Witch, and what I think she might end up actually looking like. Let's jump into my custom cards. Up first here, you'll note that the artwork here for Hagatha is not perfect. That's because I actually took this from that video you watched and adjusted it in Photoshop. Frankly, I'm pretty happy with the quality of how this turned out. But this first iteration of Hagatha, they're all going to be 8 mana. They're all going to have 5 armor. That's the standard we've seen for hero cards so far. We know it's 8 mana. So really pay attention to the battle cries here, and of course the hero powers or any other accompanying elements I have in each of these designs. So this first one here, Hagatha summons a bubbling cauldron. And of course, in that teaser video, right before they spot Hagatha, they're over a bubbling cauldron. Witches are all about cauldron, so I wanted to introduce that mechanic. And as you can see here, the bubbling cauldron is a dormant style card, something like the darkness before it has been summoned, or nether portal from the warlock quest. So this is something that would just always be on the board, can't be attacked, can't be interacted with at all. There's no way to remove it, even twisting nethers and stuff don't kill it. But the bubbling cauldron reads, at the end of your turn, destroy a random enemy minion and summon a friendly monstrosity. And you don't yet know what a monstrosity is, so let's hop over real quickly, I guess, to this screen where we can show you exactly what a monstrosity is. And basically the theme of this card is swapping stats and randomizing the stats of a minion, which feels like something a witch might do. You know, throw stuff into the bubbling cauldron, essentially. You toss a minion in here, you toss a minion in there, and then the witch brews it into some sort of crazy monstrosity. So for instance, it would take the opponent's Tar Creeper, it would destroy their Tar Creeper, and then it would summon a monstrosity with swap stats, and I think it would only be fair for it to lose all of the card text as well, so it's really just kind of a stat pile. Doesn't keep effects or death rattles or anything positive like that. So in this case, you get a 5 mana Tar Creeper that's a 3/1. Now the mana doesn't necessarily matter too much outside of maybe some evolve style effects or bringing it back into your hand with some grumble shenanigans, who knows. But you could have gotten like a 1/3 that costs 5 mana, or you could have gotten like a 5/1 that costs 3 mana. It just randomly swaps all of the stats into a new position. Now, it doesn't swap numbers within the card text, only those 3 things: mana, attack, and health. And that's how a monstrosity is formed. So Bubbling Cauldron always kills a minion and always summons you something. So it's just this permanent kind of board swing that would be really, really good, of course, against really big single target threats that your opponent plays, but actually rather weak, of course, against wide boards. So there is a bit of a upside and meta read in this card. It wouldn't be great in every matchup or in every meta, so it's not something that would be overpowered all the time. But of course, if your opponent's only playing Ragnaroses or big stuff or Spiteful Summoners, then suddenly Bubbling Cauldron is the kind of thing that could be a lot better. Now, moving on to the hero power, I guess we can still stay on the screen. I think this randomizing effect is really, really cool. So I added that into the hero power as well. You know, the witch is essentially manipulating people and changing them and turning them into monstrosities. So randomizer would be a 2-mana hero power that does the exact same thing as Bubbling Cauldron as far as swapping the stats, but it stays the original minion it is, so the card text remains. And this is something you could do both on friendly minions and on enemy minions. So for instance, if there is something across the board where it's a big taunt, and you say it's a 2/8 taunt, and you want to get through the taunt a little easier, you could use randomizer on the taunt, and you could turn it into an 8/2. Or if it's a 3-mana 2/8 like Deathlord and Wild, then you could turn it into an 8-mana 3/2, and it'd be super easy to push through. So randomizer would have some cool effects there. Also, you could use it on your own minions to swap the stats around. Maybe trying to gain some extra attack, some extra defense, maybe using on a charging minion to do something cool or interesting. The options are clearly limitless. There is clearly some inherent randomness involved as well, which not everybody loves, but it's controlled randomness, it's limited randomness, it's not going to high roll super hard ever. So I think it'd be really, really fun to see this action. So this is essentially the Cauldron version of Hagatha the Witch. I would love to see this in Shaman. I think it's really cool to give them that big single target removal and essentially make this card rather weak against wide boards. So you couldn't play this into an aggro matchup, for instance. It would just be way, way too slow. Bubbling Cauldron is only good in really grindy, long games with bigger individual threats. And the fact that this doesn't really immediately impact the board other than killing a single minion means you need time to play this. It's only good in really late game environments. So I like that balancing aspect of Hagatha the Witch here, and I think this would be so cool to see. I really, really like this mechanic and how this one turned out. So now let's move on to my second iteration here of Hagatha the Witch. This one's a lot simpler, and of course uses a new keyword, as you'll soon see. Hagatha the Witch here says, your thoughts begin to echo. Now that's just a little bit of fantasy. That doesn't actually mean anything. It basically just means you don't get a battle cry, which is something we haven't yet seen with any of the hero cards. But hey, this is a whole new world. These aren't Death Knights. This is just a witch. So who knows? She may not have a battle cry, but her new passive hero power would become all your minion cards have echo. And just a reminder, echo is the new keyword, which means once you play a card, you can continue to replay it as long as you have the mana to do it, much like Unstable Evolution, which of course is a very fitting mechanic for Shaman, because that's really one of the first places we saw, or I guess actually the first place we ever saw an echo style effect in action. And clearly, too, this is a haunted, spooky woods where Hagatha has made some ghosts and some spooky stuff happen, so it seems like echoes are ghosts of the original version of the card, so it's really quite fitting for Hagatha as well. Now, clearly, giving all of your cards echo can do some crazy stuff. I haven't even thought about all of the possible combinations, all the crazy combos and shenanigans. I immediately recognize that you can't do it with spells, or something like Lightning Bolt suddenly becomes one card that does 30 damage in a single turn. Now, there are some minions that could do scary stuff in that way too, but it's much, much harder, I think, to abuse minions. So I'm not going to say this is 100% balanced, or there's not some OP combo. In fact, I challenge you guys to think of an awesome OP combo in Shaman that could utilize Echo. I'd like to hear that. That would be really, really interesting to see just what kind of limitations need to be in place for this sort of effect. But I'm assuming there are some crazy overpowered things you can do, right? That's kind of the assumption, because playing Hagatha is terrible. The turn you play Hagatha, you can do almost nothing, right? All you get is 5 armor. You don't get any instant value. So you have to count on the fact that this passive hero power is really, really good to make it worth it. Most Death Knights do something the turn they're played that makes them so valuable. Malfurion summons you a couple taunts, or poisonous guys to get in the way. Jaina at least gives you a 1 water elemental and a lot of long-term value. Gul'dan, of course, gives you a bajillion things. Thrall, the other Shaman hero card, it evolves your board in an enormous way. So this one would be an incredibly passive and slow turn. You could not play this against an aggro deck without absolutely melting to the aggression. Passing an 8 mana turn is completely absurd. So this, again, is a card that would be very, very good in control-style matchups, stuff that goes long, perhaps some sort of combo build where you're just stalling, trying to stay alive, and then utilizing some crazy card combinations with echoes and battle cries and grumbles. Who knows what else? There's, again, probably a million different combos where you can do stuff, particularly with Grumble. But that's what I like about it. It kind of feeds into some of the stuff we've seen in Shaman recently with the battle cry manipulations. It seems to fit the Shaman mindset pretty well. So I would love, once again, to see this be Hagatha the Witch. And frankly, I think it's almost possible now. Maybe this, for instance, is the reason Blizzard took out a card like Cold Light Oracle. Because if you played Cold Light Oracle and you grumbled your Cold Light Oracle and you had a 1-mana Cold Light Oracle and you had a Cold Light Oracle that you could just echo over and over again, I'm sure there's some kind of crazy combination where you could just draw your opponent's entire deck or something silly, right? So maybe that's why they had to move Cold Light Oracle to Wild to prevent that from taking over Standard with the introduction of Hagatha the Witch. I don't know. We may never know, but I would like to see Echo implemented into Hagatha, certainly, so I hope that this card might just be the one. So let's move on to my third version of Hagatha the Witch here, and this one is all about building into totems, because clearly Blizzard has implemented a handful of different totem synergy cards in Kobolds and Catacombs, but so far they just haven't worked. You cannot build a good basic totem shaman deck. People have tried. When you look at the win rates, they're just abysmal. They're some of the worst cards in the set because you're running so many bad totem synergy cards. Playing totems themselves never really feels good. So this version of Hagatha would essentially take your basic totems and it would upgrade them. And as you'll soon see, I guess you've probably already read by now the battle cry here, but the battle cry is that it summons you 2 random basic totems, and your basic totems are cursed this game. And what that means is essentially they're going to be twisted, manipulated, improved, certainly, but sometimes do the opposite of what they do now even, because Hagatha the Witch has taken your totems and she's turned them into witchly talismans to corrupt you and your opponents. And that's essentially these 4 totems. Now, they would stay the same as far as artwork and name are concerned, so that the totem synergy cards we have now would suddenly be using these. Much like with the Jaina hero card right now, where all of your elementals automatically get lifesteal, this would apply a game state where all of your totems automatically just transform into these improved versions of your totem. So when you're playing things like Kobold Hermit, for instance, your Kobold Hermit would now summon an improved Stoneclaw Totem, a cursed Stoneclaw Totem, instead of just a regular 0/2 taunt. So as we go through these totems, you can see Stoneclaw Totem is no longer about a defensive card. It's been corrupted, so now it's a charging minion. Searing Totem doesn't just attack anymore. Now it's like a little mini Ragnaros, essentially, and I think probably the best card out of all of these. The Wrath of Air Totem gets a big old stat gain, and it also does negative spell damage to your opponent. That's pretty crazy. That's something we haven't really seen in Hearthstone yet. So their spells would all hit for 2 less damage if you summon a Wrath of Air Totem. And then finally, Healing Totem, instead of healing your board, actually does sort of a Despicable Dreadlord effect, where it deals 1 damage pings to the opponent's side of the board at the end of the turn. So basically the opposite of what it does now. And your hero power would become a way to summon any of these by choice. So instead of a random one, you actually get to choose which one you want, which makes them, of course, really, really powerful, because you can choose that charging totem to do some damage. You can choose Searing Totem for onboard value. If you need an AoE, you can Healing Totem. If you're worried about combo damage from your opponent or something, you can play Wrath of Air to try to stay alive. So a really, really strong hero power, because each of these is probably a 3 to 4 mana minion on its own. Some are more utility based, some are more raw value based, but probably 3 to 4 mana. So you're kind of getting double the value of what a 2 mana hero power would normally look like, and way more value than a normal totem, in fact. Not to mention this empowers all those other synergy cards. Some might say this is too strong, but I don't think it's that much better than something like the Gul'dan hero power, or clearly the Jaina hero power, which can summon you a 3/6 every turn. It's far more consistent than Jaina, but it's not that much more value than something like Gul'dan's from a raw mana standpoint. So I think this actually is pretty balanced. Not to mention that for 8 mana, just getting 2 totems isn't that good of a play. And they're random, so they're not going to have taunt, for instance, because none of these have taunt. So it's something that would still be pretty risky to play against aggro. Your opponent could probably still just push through. You might get charged to trade in a little bit, right? You might get a Searing Totem that does some work, but it can also backfire. You could get like 2 Wrath of Air totems and not be that happy with your 8 mana play, and you could just be dead. So I think it is balanced despite being fairly strong. But I like this idea of building into totems. Clearly a failed mechanic from Blizzard so far, so let's take that, let's make it good using Hagatha the Witch. Of course, I also like this idea of corrupting or cursing all these totems so that they do something different, and in fact often do the opposite of what they do now. So now let's move on to my 4th version of Hagatha the Witch, and this one's going to probably confuse some people. And in fact, I know it will, because I already had this discussion on Twitch, and that's because this Hagatha is all about freezing and freeze effects. And clearly, thematically, from a fantasy standpoint, Hagatha the Witch does not seem like a card that would freeze anything. Witches don't traditionally freeze stuff. That's not one of their kind of things they do. But there's this sort of conspiracy theory or sentiment among some people that Thrall Deathseer, the previous hero card for Shaman, the Death Knight, which evolves minions, but is quite obviously centered thematically around ice and freezing, and he has voice lines that very clearly point to him doing something freeze-related on the board when he's played, not to mention the fact that all these freeze cards were released in Knights of the Frozen Throne. There's essentially a conspiracy theory or a belief that Thrall originally had some kind of freeze mechanic. And for whatever reason, Blizzard realized it wasn't balanced, or it's going to be too OP, or there was some crazy combination that they couldn't handle in standard format at that time. So they essentially took Thrall's mechanic, hero power, battle cry, whatever it might have been, and they changed it. They just said, okay, we're going to delay the freeze stuff, and we're just going to make it an evolve, because we've got evolve, that's a mechanic. We can design a sort of evolve thing. But they had already recorded the voice lines, they'd already done the artwork for Thrall, so the evolve thing didn't really fit the fantasy or the theme of the card. So my thought is, maybe they now realize that with a standard format rotation, whatever the hang-up was, whatever the problem card was, whatever the mechanic was, might just be pushed forward, and they've got all this leftover design they love and this idea that they love, and now it's suddenly pushed onto the next expansion, or actually now 2 expansions down the line. So here we go, the only hero card in the set. Why did Shaman get this one random hero card? Maybe it's because Blizzard already had a design complete. They already have cards from previous sets which synergize with this design. So even though it would be thematically odd and unusual, it could be the lazy man's way out. Now this would be incredibly unfortunate, I would say, because you don't want like your star villain for the expansion to not make sense within the context of the expansion. But by that same logic, the Thrall hero card didn't make a ton of sense either. So I'm hoping this isn't actually a thing. I'm hoping this is just a conspiracy theory at best, but still to explore what a good freeze-based hero card might be like and how we might make some of these freeze synergy cards relevant. Let's talk about this version of Hagatha the Witch. Anyway, that was a really long preface to get to this point. But Hagatha the Witch here would essentially freeze all minions upon play, both allied and enemy minions. And also, much like Jaina applies lifesteal to her elementals, with Hagatha, any minion that gets frozen, any friendly minion that gets frozen, would permanently gain +5/+5 in stats. So if you, for instance, had a Searing Totem on board when you played Hagatha the Witch, you would freeze your Searing Totem, your opponent's stuff, and your Searing Totem would become a 6/6 instantly. But the problem is, of course, it's frozen, so you don't get to use it as a 6/6 immediately, which means you pass initiative back to your opponent. Now, in the particular instance of playing Hagatha the Witch, that means you're going to get a ton of stats on board the instant you play her, as long as you have stuff out there. But that's a bit of a win-more sort of scenario, right, if you already have a ton of stuff. Also, the way that works, your minions wouldn't get to attack for 2 turns. Well, actually, that depends a little bit on whether or not you utilized your attack phase, but most likely they wouldn't get to attack for another turn in the future. Like, it'd come back to you and they still wouldn't be able to attack with that stat buff. So essentially, it's a bit like the card Cryostasis, which we saw already. That buffs your minion, but it also freezes it. So you get the advantage of the buff, but you have to wait a while to utilize it. Now, on top of that, you just get a simple freeze hero power here that just freezes whatever target you hit with it. That could hit both faces and minions, enemy minions and allied minions, which is really cool because sometimes you can just get that freeze to stall out your opponent and deny their giant threat from hitting your face, whatever it might be. Other times you might freeze a taunt minion on your side of the board to give it a giant stat buff. So clearly there's some downside to freezing your own things, but the upside of the giant stat buff I think makes up for it. So you could really use this well, for instance, with taunts. It would be a fantastic big taunt building kind of thing. The deck that runs a lot of taunts, Shaman can do that already in some ways, and this might help support that, and it would help build in some of those other freeze cards. And most of the freeze cards so far seem more value oriented, more control and late game oriented, so I think this would fit into that picture really nicely. Now again, I think this would have been way better with Thrall, Deathseer, as its target, as its character, because Hagatha the Witch doesn't make sense, but ultimately I think this would be a good way to empower those freeze mechanics that certainly right now are absolutely dead, much like the totem mechanics. Shaman's had a few failed mechanics in a row, unfortunately, so this might be a way to bring one of them back to life. And now finally for my fifth design for Hagatha the Witch, this is one that I thought was all about sort of decay. I like the idea of a witch, you know, sort of decaying the forest, decaying her enemies, and I think Hagatha the Witch captures that pretty well with this card effect. Essentially, once you play Hagatha the Witch, all minions, both allied and enemy, would randomly lose 1 attack or 1 health at the end of each turn. So your turn and your opponent's turn, much like Gruul activates at the end of both people's turns. This isn't just on your own turns. So for the rest of the game, all minions are constantly in a state of decay. And I think that's really, really cool. And now it's a little bit random, of course, right, because it's health or attack. So sometimes you might be hoping that you kill a 1 health minion, but instead you just remove an attack from it and that backfires. Other times you might be really happy to put a minion down to 0 attack just so it's stuck on your opponent's board and they can't do anything with it. It's just a dead card. And I built in a hero power here that sort of supports a game plan where you don't run minions, because if minions are constantly decaying, if they're always getting worse, then playing minions doesn't feel very good. You are using that as a debuff against your opponent, so you need a style of play, a game plan that doesn't rely so heavily on minions. And Run in Despair, which sounds a bit like Rune Spear, would essentially allow you to discover a spell and cast it with random targets. That's right, I completely hijacked Rune Spear's effect, and I put it into a hero power, because I think Rune Spear failed. It's too expensive and too slow. But the idea is pretty interesting, which is to rely on spells to win the game. And this would give you a consistent way to generate spells. Now, generating a spell every turn for 2 mana would be way too good normally. That's just a great card draw that doesn't pull from your deck. It gives you a pretty good choice at what you want to pick. But since it's casting it randomly, that's much, much worse. Harder to control. It kind of limits the value cap a bit. So you're not just snowballing into a crazy lead, but you still get those occasional volcanoes and lightning storms that do a lot of work and soften up the opponent's board. So I think another card here that has a bit of a risk-reward and inherent balance built into it, because it's symmetrical in its effect, and it makes it hard for your opponent, but not impossible. Like, you can still play cards, you can still get value out of them. It's just a constant, overwhelming force. Now, I haven't really thought about the implications of how good this is. For instance, if your opponent plays, let's say, like a Void Lord, at the end of their turn, it drops to a 3/8. And then at the end of it comes back to you, you've got to deal with a 3/8, right? And then if you end your turn, it maybe goes down to a 2/8. Like, it takes a while for that to really, like, a 2/8 still pretty good on a Void Lord with that Death Rattle, right? It's probably much, much better against wide boards than tall boards, because if they have 6 minions out, you're negatively impacting 6 stats per turn instead of 1. So this is almost the opposite of the Cauldron that we talked about earlier, because the Cauldron was better against 1 big minion. This would be better against wide boards, which Shaman is pretty good against anyway. So that might be a tad redundant, but I still like the idea here of emphasizing that sort of decay that a witch seems like it would do. So I am pretty happy with how this one turned out too. And there you have it, folks. Those are my 5 designs for Hagatha the Witch. Again, clearly the chance of any of these being remotely close to what Blizzard actually uses is practically non-existent. It's really, really hard to guess what a card might look like. But I still think this was a really productive exercise to explore some of the faults and failings that Shaman is currently experiencing, seeing if there are ways to prop up some of these central mechanics, talking about the themes and ideas of sort of a Witchwood, which is clearly the name of the expansion and a theme that Blizzard's going to be exploring too. So it's also just fun to speculate and make new cards. It's really, really fun for me to actually go through and do this exercise too. So even if I didn't make the video, this would probably be something I'd be doing anyway, just because it's really enjoyable to make custom cards for whatever reason. That said, I'm curious what you guys think. What did I miss here? What was like super OP? What's not good enough? How would you change these cards? What do you think Hagatha is going to be? Is my conspiracy theory about Thrall totally nonsense? Whatever you think, share it in the comments below. I love getting everyone else's take. All that said, of course, thank you guys so much for watching. And until next time, game on.